In the brittle, wind-scoured autumn of 1983, 26-year-old Nora Callan inherited the silence of her grandfather's 480 acres of exhausted Kansas wheatland. She inherited the listing grain bins, the Ford tractor with the cracked manifold that leaked exhaust into the cab, and the particular loneliness of standing in the middle of a flat piece of earth that stretched to the horizon and in every direction and seemed to want nothing more to do with people. But most importantly, she inherited his notebooks, not the financial ledgers. Those were a grim record of declining yields and mounting input costs that she could barely bring herself to read. She inherited the other ones. The small, spiral-bound field notes pads he had kept in his shirt pocket for 40 years, stained with grease and coffee and the ochre dust of the high plains. She had found them in a shoebox under his workbench, 63 of them, rubber-banded in groups of 10. She read them all in the first 2 weeks after the funeral, sitting at his kitchen table with a pot of coffee that she kept reheating on the old gas range. The notebooks were not poetry, and they were not science. They were the raw observations of a man who had spent his entire life paying close attention. He noted which corners of which fields dried out first after a rain. He wrote about the smell of the soil in March versus the smell in June. He had pressed a clover leaf between 2 pages and written beside it, "Grew here without planting." Why here and not 10 feet south? And on the inside back cover of Notebook 41, in handwriting shakier than his usual, he had written a single line that Nora read 4 times before she set the pad down and stared out the window at the dead fields. The soil isn't tired, it's starving. There's a difference. The men at the grain elevator in Pratt, Kansas, did not speak of soil being starving. They spoke of it in the language of chemistry and tonnage. The diagnosis for Nora's land was the same diagnosis they had given every piece of ground in Pratt County that had been in continuous wheat for 30 years. Nitrogen depletion, compaction lost, organic matter. The prescription was equally uniform. Anhydrous ammonia in the fall, a herbicide pass in the spring, and enough diesel to run the chisel plow through ground that had become almost as hard as the Kalish rock underneath it. It was a treatment that cost more every year and produced results that improved less every year, and everyone in the elevator understood this, and nobody said it out loud because the alternative was a silence that felt too much like giving up. Nora's grandfather, Elias Callan, had resisted the full chemical program for years. He was not opposed to it on principle. He was a practical man who had no patience for ideology of any kind. He resisted it because it required debt, and he had a deep, almost physical aversion to debt that his granddaughter had inherited as completely as she had inherited. His cheekbones, his yields had suffered for it. In the last decade of his life, he was producing less per acre than his neighbors, spending less per acre than his neighbors, and the math had worked out to roughly 0, year after year. He had not lost the farm. He had not saved it either. He had left it to Nora because she was the one who had walked the fields with him. She was the one at 16, at 18, at 22 during college breaks, who had pulled on her boots and gone out with him in the early morning when the dew was still on the wheat stubble and the meadowlarks were making their noise. He hadn't lectured her. He had just walked slowly and stopped often and crouched down to run his hands through the soil. And sometimes he said something, and sometimes he didn't. Once on a November morning when the fields were bare and the sky was the color of pewter, he stopped at the edge of the dry creek bed that ran along the east section and pointed at the bank. "Look at that," he said. She looked. The exposed bank showed the layers of the earth, pale topsoil, maybe 3 inches of it, and then the dense gray subsoil beneath, almost like clay. Your great-grandmother remembered when that black layer was 8 inches deep, he said, Took 60 years to lose 5 inches. He stood up slowly, his knees bothering him already then. Took 10,000 years to build it. We unlocked the safe and spent what was in it. He didn't tell her what to do about it. He wasn't sure there was anything to do about it. He just wanted her to see it, to hold the knowledge of it, the way you hold something fragile and irreplaceable because you know what it costs to break it. After the funeral, after the notebooks, Nora made a decision that had no logical precedent. She drove her grandfather's battered Chevy pickup not to the co-op to order her fall anhydrous application, but to the state library in Wichita, where she spent 3 days reading everything she could find about soil microbiology. She was not a scientist. She had a degree in agricultural business that had prepared her to read balance sheets and operate GPS guidance systems and understand commodity futures, and none of it had prepared her for what she found in those library stacks. She found a world she hadn't known existed, a world of mycorrhizal fungi and bacterial colonies and the nitrogen cycle, the actual nitrogen cycle, not the simplified version on the fertilizer bag, but the real, living, recursive process by which certain bacteria convert atmospheric nitrogen into plant-available forms, a process that had been operating in healthy soil for 400 million years before any human being thought to pour anhydrous ammonia on it. She drove home with a notebook of her own, a spiral pad she had bought at a gas station, the same kind her grandfather had used, and 3 library books, and a feeling that she would later describe as the difference between walking in a dark room and someone turning on a dim lamp. You couldn't see everything, but you could see enough. What she decided to do, in the end, was simple in the way that many things are simple once you understand them, and in the way that almost nothing is simple before you do. She would stop tilling. She would stop the anhydrous. She would plant a cover crop mix, winter rye, hairy vetch, and crimson clover, on the fields she wasn't putting into winter wheat, and she would let it grow, and then roll it down in the spring and plant her cash crop directly into the mulch. She had spent almost no money on any of this. The cover crop seed was the largest expense, and it was a fraction of what the anhydrous would have cost. She had just enough cash from her grandfather's small savings account to get through 1 year without an income if she had to. Her neighbor to the north was a man named Mr. Dillard, Gerald Dillard, who had farmed the adjacent section for 30 years and knew the land the way Nora knew her grandfather's notebooks, from long familiarity with both affection and frustration. He was not an unkind man. He was a practical man, and practical men in Pratt County in 1983 planted wheat and applied inputs and watched the weather and hoped. When he saw Nora's fields going into what looked like weeds instead of clean, bare fallow ground, he drove his truck down the fence line and stopped. Nora. He called over the fence. His voice was the voice of someone who feels they have an obligation. What are you putting in over there? Cover crop, she said. Winter rye and vetch, mostly. He looked at the green fuzz emerging from the field, then looked at her. You're not going to be able to plant into that in the spring. Ground's too rough. You'll have standing matter. That's the idea, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The wind came across the flat land and pushed at both of them. Your granddad, he said finally with a kind of careful diplomacy, tried a few unconventional things over the years. Some of them worked out all right. The pause that followed told her everything about which ones hadn't. You've got good land under there, Nora. Don't let it get away from you. He drove off. She went back to work. The story moved around the county, the way stories move in flat, open country, where people have long sight lines and long memories, quickly and with embellishment. Nora Callan had gone back to the home place and planted weeds. Grief did strange things to people, and the Callans had always been a little sideways. Her grandfather had refused anhydrous for years, and look what it had done to his yields. Now the girl was doing it worse. Let me stop here and ask you something, because I think it matters. Have you ever made a decision that you knew, in the quietest and most honest part of yourself, was right, and felt absolutely alone in that knowledge? Not combative, not defiant, just alone. The way you are alone in the middle of a big piece of ground when the wind is blowing and there is no one around for miles. That was where Nora Callan stood in the winter of 1983, with fields full of cover crop and a county full of skepticism, and a grandfather's notebook that she read every morning at the kitchen table, like some people read scripture. The official verdict came in February, delivered by a man named Mr. Aldrich, the Kansas State Extension agronomist for Pratt County, who had been in the position for 11 years and who approached his job with the methodical confidence of a man who had studied the research literature and found it to be adequate. He had heard from several farmers about the Callan place. He felt it was part of his job to make a visit. He drove a white state vehicle and carried a leather binder. He walked Nora's fields with her in the cold February wind and looked at the cover crop, knee-high now, the rye dark green, the vetch sprawling across it in pale tendrils with the expression of a doctor looking at a rash he has seen before. "Miss Callan," he said, "I want to be straightforward with you. I understand the appeal of what's sometimes called alternative approaches to soil management. There's been some interesting preliminary research out of Ohio and Nebraska, but the Kansas data doesn't support skipping your nitrogen application on depleted ground. Your grandfather's records show this section hasn't tested above 1.2% organic matter in 15 years. You need a minimum of 140 pounds of available nitrogen per acre to hit your yield targets in winter wheat. This," he gestured at the cover crop, not dismissively, but with the careful neutrality of a man who is trying not to be unkind, "this will not provide that." "The vetch fixes nitrogen," Nora said. "That's what it does. It's a legume." "In theory, yes," Mr. Aldrich said. "In a healthy soil with an established rhizobial population, you might get 80 to 100 pounds per acre from a mature vetch stand. But your soil," he paused, choosing his words, "your soil bacteria are depleted. You'd be relying on a biological system that doesn't have the infrastructure to function at capacity. You could lose a season or two establishing that infrastructure. Can you afford that?" It was a real question. She could hear that he meant it honestly. "I don't know," she said, "but I can't afford to keep doing what my grandfather did." "Either, Mr. Aldrich made notes in his leather binder. He looked at her with something that might have been respect and might have been pity, and was probably some of both. "If you'd like," he said, "I can help you apply for an emergency operating loan through the FSA. We can get your inputs covered for this season, and you can revisit the alternative approach when you're on more stable financial footing." "Thank you," Nora said. "I'm going to see this through." He drove away. The white truck disappeared down the straight section line road, and Nora stood in her field in the February cold, with her grandfather's voice, somewhere in the back of her mind, saying the thing he had always said when she got discouraged. "You can't know the end of a thing from the middle of it." The second visitor came in April, when the cover crop was fully mature and beginning to flower, and the whole field smelled extravagantly of clover and something underneath it, something earthy and alive. His name was Mr. Holt, Dale Holt, and he drove a company pickup with the logo of a major agricultural chemical firm on the door. He was a regional account manager, and he had the particular manner of a man who has built a career on being agreeable. He wasn't mocking. He was the other thing, the thing that is harder to resist than mockery because it comes wrapped in sympathy. "Nora," he said, leaning on her fence post with his arms crossed in a pose of casual friendliness, I've been hearing about what you're trying to do out here, and I want you to know I respect it. I really do. The biological approach, the cover cropping. That's the direction the conversation is going. No question. He nodded, slowly, the nod of a man affirming something they both already know. But here's my concern. You're in year one. You're building a system that might take 3 to 5 years to reach the kind of microbial density you need to fully replace your synthetic inputs, and you're doing it on a shoestring. He uncrossed his arms. I can set you up with a split application, half your normal nitrogen rate, time to work with your cover crop breakdown. You'd be bridging the gap. You wouldn't be giving up on your approach. You'd just be giving it a runway. He was offering her a reasonable thing. That was what made it dangerous. She looked at the field behind him. The rolled cover crop lay in thick brown windrows, already beginning to break down in the April warmth, and beneath the mulch, the soil was darker than it had been in October, and it smelled different. She had noticed this 2 weeks ago, and had written it in her notebook because her grandfather had always said, "You should write down the things you noticed before you understood them." "Mr. Holt," she said, "if I put nitrogen on now, I'll never know if the system works." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she recognized, the expression of someone recalculating a person they had underestimated. "You'll know it doesn't work," he said, "if your wheat comes in at a loss and you have to sell the place." "That's true," she said. "I understand the risk. Thank you for coming out." He got in his truck and he drove away, and the dust settled on the gravel road, and Nora stood at her fence line for a long time looking at the field. Now let me tell you about Elias Callan, because without him none of this makes sense. He was born on that land in 1912. His father had broken the original sod with horses. Elias had seen the dust bowl from the kitchen window of that same farmhouse, had watched the black clouds roll in from the northwest in 1935, and understood, at 23 years old, what it meant when a civilization mined the soil the way you mined coal. He never forgot it, long after the other farmers had switched to the full chemical program, long after the co-op had stopped stocking anything that didn't come out of a bag or a tank. Elias had kept his notebooks and walked his fields and paid attention to things that didn't have a line item in the farm budget. He had noticed, for instance, that the old creek bed on the east section, the one that still ran in wet years, produced wheat that was darker green and more disease-resistant than the wheat anywhere else on the farm. He'd noted this every year for a decade. He'd written, "Different here. Why? Creek brings something, or keeps something." He had noticed that the corner of the south field where the old cottonwood had stood before it blew down in the tornado of 1966 still produced better than the surrounding ground. He'd written, "Tree gone 17 years. Soil still remembers it." He had noticed that after years of tillage, the ground that had once been his most productive was becoming lighter in color and harder to work, and he'd written, in the shakier handwriting of his late 70s, "We are eating the house we live in," and calling it farming. He never put it all together into a plan. He was too old, too tired, too uncertain, but he had written it all down, and he had walked with Nora, and he had trusted her with the knowledge that the problem existed even if he didn't know the solution. Nora was the solution, or she was trying to be. Let me explain now what she was actually doing, because the story sounds like faith, and it was partly faith, but it was also chemistry and biology and a fair amount of careful management. When she rolled her cover crop in late April and planted her winter wheat directly into the mulch with a no-till drill, she was doing several things at once. The decomposing plant matter was feeding soil bacteria, specifically. She was hoping to feed the rhizobial bacteria that live in symbiosis with legume roots and fix atmospheric nitrogen into ammonium that plants can use. The mulch layer was holding moisture in soil that typically lost its surface moisture within days of a rain. The absence of tillage meant the soil's physical structure, the channels left by earthworm burrows, the aggregates built by fungal hyphae, was being preserved instead of destroyed, and the winter rye, which had very deep roots, had broken up the compaction layer in a way that no chisel plow had ever managed, because roots find the paths of least resistance and then widen them, a slow and patient work that machinery cannot replicate. She was also doing something that no agronomist had recommended and no book had specifically prescribed. She was watching. Every week, she walked her fields the way her grandfather had walked them, slowly, stopping often, crouching down. She kept her notebook. She noted where the mulch broke down fastest and where it lay thick and impermeable. She noted where the emerging wheat showed the dark, vigorous green of adequate nitrogen and where it showed the pale, yellowish hue of deficiency. She pulled plants up by the roots and examined them. She dug small holes with a trowel and looked at the soil profile and smelled it. The smell was changing. She wrote that down. The first year was hard. Her wheat yield came in at 28 bushels per acre. The county average was 38. She lost money, not catastrophically. She had no input costs to speak of, and wheat prices were decent that year. But the margin was thin, and the thin margin left no room for anything to go wrong. And that winter was the loneliest she could remember, sitting in the farmhouse reading her grandfather's notebooks by the light of the lamp and trying to believe in a process that had not yet produced visible results. There was one afternoon in January of 1985, the second winter, when she came very close to calling the FSA about that operating loan. She had driven to town for groceries and run into Mr. Dillard at the feed store, and he had been kind, which was in some ways worse than if he had been contemptuous. He had asked how she was doing, and she had said fine, and he had looked at her with the careful sympathy of someone who knows you are not fine, and said that if she ever wanted to talk about options, his brother-in-law was a good land broker, fair prices, no pressure. She had thanked him and driven home and sat in the truck in the driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. That evening, she opened Notebook 41 to the inside back cover and read her grandfather's line. The soil isn't tired, it's starving. There's a difference. And below it, in her own handwriting, she had copied something she'd found in one of the library books. Biological systems do not scale on human timelines. Patience is not a virtue in this context. It is a methodology. She closed the notebook. She went to bed. She did not call the FSA. The third year was when things began to shift, and the shift was not dramatic, but it was unmistakable. She found earthworms, not one or two, but dozens, in every trowel of soil she turned. The soil itself had a different texture, looser, more crumbly, what soil scientists call good tilth, the quality that makes soil feel almost alive between your fingers, that gives it a slight resistance and then yields like bread dough. The wheat that spring had a dark, saturated green that she had not seen on that land in her memory. She pulled plants and looked at the root systems, and they were extensive in a way that startled her, reaching deep into the profile and rebranching in the pattern that a healthy soil allows and a compacted soil prevents. Her yield came in at 41 bushels per acre. The county average that year was 36. She sent a soil sample to the Kansas State Lab in a plain envelope and waited 3 weeks for the results. When she opened the report, her organic matter was at 1.9%, up from the 1.2% that Mr. Aldrich had cited 3 years before. Available nitrogen was moderate but stable. Microbial biomass, a measure of how many living organisms were present in a gram of soil, was rated as high. The land was feeding itself. The fourth year brought a late spring frost that killed the first wheat emergence in most of the county. The fields that had been chemically dependent had thin topsoil with poor aggregate structure. And when the frost came, and then the thaw came, and then another frost came, the bare soil heaved, and the fragile seedlings had no protection. Nora's fields, with their thick residue layer and their deep-rooted, resilient plants, lost some of the early planting, but less than anyone else. She replanted earlier into warmer soil that held its temperature better because of the organic matter, and her stand was more complete than any of her neighbors. That autumn, the Pratt County Harvest Report listed her at 47 bushels per acre. The county average was 39. She had achieved it with no synthetic nitrogen, no herbicides, a fraction of the water usage, and her input costs per acre were approximately 1/5 of the county average. The numbers went up on the board at the elevator, and the way people looked at them, the way people look at something that contradicts what they believed was true. The laughter that had been quiet before was gone now. What replaced it was something more complicated, a silence that had in it both acknowledgement and resistance, the silence of people who are not yet ready to say they were wrong but can no longer maintain that they were right. It was 18 months after that harvest that Dale Holt's company truck appeared again on Nora's road. He had aged in the 4 years since she had last seen him. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by something more careful. He found her in the south field, walking her rows with her notebook, and she watched him come across the field toward her and wondered what he had come to say. He said, "I owe you something." She waited. "I told you this wouldn't work," he said. "I was wrong. What you're doing here?" He stopped and looked at the field around him. It was October, post-harvest, and the soil was the dark, rich brown of chocolate cake, and the volunteer rye was already coming up in the wheel tracks, and the field smelled of something that was the opposite of the chemical smell she associated with most farm ground. It smelled green and old and honest. "I've been doing this job for 14 years, he said. "I've never seen a dryland wheat field in Kansas look like this." "What do you want, Mr. Holt?" she asked. He was honest about it, which she respected. "My company is trying to develop a biological product line," he said. "Microbial inoculants, cover crop blends, transitional support programs. We think the market is moving this direction, and we want to be in front of it. I've told them about what you've done here, and they'd like to support a demonstration project on your land. Compensation, of course. And the story, your story, would be part of the marketing. The woman who proved it could work in Kansas." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind came through the field, and the volunteer rye bent and straightened. "You want to sell my farm as a product," she said. "Not your farm," he said quickly. The system," she said. "That's what the other man said, too. Package it, license it, put it in a bag." She shook her head slowly. "Mr. Holt, if I let your company put its name on what's happening in this soil, I'd be telling farmers that they can buy their way into this, and they can't. They have to earn it. They have to stop and observe and learn what their specific land needs and be patient enough to let it respond. There's no product that does that. The product is the attention." He stood there in her field with his hands in the pockets of his jacket, and he looked like what he was, a man who had come seeking something he could quantify and found something he could not. "The attention," he repeated. "My grandfather paid attention to this land for 60 years, she said. "I've been paying it for 5. That's the investment. You can't put that in a bag and sell it for $12 an acre." He nodded slowly. He looked like a man absorbing a piece of information that rearranged other pieces of information around it. He thanked her for her time and walked back across the field to his truck, and Nora watched the truck until it was a white dot on the ruler straight section road and then gone. She wrote in her notebook. He came to buy the answer, left without it. The answer isn't for sale because it isn't mine. The years that followed moved the way the soil recovered, not in sudden lurches, but in a slow, accumulating richness. By 1990, she was consistently among the top producers in Pratt County on a per-acre basis, and her input costs were so far below the county average that the local farm paper ran a short piece about her that got picked up by the Regional Agricultural Journal. People started calling and writing. Extension agents from 3 states asked to visit. A graduate student from Kansas State arrived one fall morning and spent a week taking soil cores and asking questions that Nora answered from her notebooks, the spiral-bound ones her grandfather had used, and the newer ones she had filled herself. Mr. Dillard came to her in the hard year of 1991, when interest rates had settled into the bones of his operation and he could no longer service his input loans on what the market was paying for wheat. He came to her directly, without the land broker, because he wanted to deal with her and not with a middleman. He sat at the same kitchen table where she had read her grandfather's notebooks, and he told her what the farm was worth and what he needed for it. She paid him fair. As he stood at his truck to leave, he looked across the section road at his own land, her land now, with an expression she recognized from her grandfather's face, the expression of someone who is leaving something they had hoped to keep. "Your grandfather," he said, "used to say the land had a long memory. I thought that was just an old man talking." He got in the truck. I know what he meant now. She took his depleted land, and she did with it what she had done with her own. She planted cover crops and stopped tillage and walked the rows and kept her notebooks and waited. It was slower to recover than her original ground. The chemical dependency had run deeper. The soil biology was more thoroughly disrupted, but it recovered. In 3 years, earthworms were appearing in the soil cores. In 5 years, the organic matter was climbing. In 7, the field was indistinguishable from the land she had inherited. She bought one other farm over the following decade, from a woman who had tried to hold on alone after her husband died and found she could not. Nora's farm grew from 480 acres to just over 400. She hired 2 people from the county to help her, not equipment operators, but observers, people who wanted to learn to read the land the way her grandfather had read it. She paid them well, and she taught them slowly, and she gave each of them a spiral-bound notebook on their first day. If you were to visit that land today, you would find a woman in her mid-40s, her dark hair beginning to gray at the temples, her hands capable and calloused in the particular way of someone who works with them daily. She walks her fields in the early morning the way her grandfather walked his, slowly, stopping often. Her eyes are not worried. There is something in them that is the product of having bet everything on an idea that took years to prove, and then watching the proof accumulate, quietly and when without fanfare, in the soil beneath her feet. In the farmhouse, on the desk in the back room, sits the shoebox with the 63 spiral notebooks. Next to it sits a newer shoebox, this one holding 41 notebooks in her own handwriting, filled with observations and questions, and the small, careful records of a person who has learned that the answers are always in the land, if you are willing to slow down enough to hear them. The county agricultural office in Pratt still has the files from Aldrich's 1984 visit buried in a cabinet somewhere, with his assessment that the biological infrastructure of the Callan farm was too depleted to support a no-input system. Mr. Aldrich retired in 1998. In his last year in the position, he visited Nora's farm twice and took more notes than he had taken in his entire career. He did not apologize because she did not require an apology, but he stood in her south field on his second visit and crumbled her soil between his fingers, dark and rich and alive with the smell of something that takes decades to build. and he said more to himself than to her. Your grandfather knew something. He knew how to pay attention, she said. That's all he knew. That's all any of us know. That evening she walked the fence line of the east section, the one along the old creek bed, the one her grandfather had pointed at, and asked why it was different from the field 10 feet south. The soil there was now the deepest black on the whole farm. She had a theory. The creek had once flooded seasonally, depositing silt and organic matter, supporting a different community of organisms, a richer baseline that had persisted even through the years of degradation. She hadn't proved it. She had written it in her notebook and kept walking and kept watching. Her grandfather had asked the question in 1971. She was still working on the answer. That is, perhaps, exactly how it should be. The soil doesn't yield its secrets all at once, and neither does the work of healing it. There are no shortcuts, no products to buy, no loans that accelerate the timeline. There is only attention and patience, and the willingness to believe that a piece of ground that looks exhausted is not dead, but only waiting. Waiting for someone to stop treating it like a factory floor and start treating it like what it actually is, the living foundation of everything we eat and everything we are and everything we hope to leave behind. Nora Callan understood that. Her grandfather had begun to understand it. The notebooks passed between them across time, as steady and as nourishing as the dark water that moves, unseen, through the healed earth of the Kansas High Plains, feeding what is living, restoring what was lost, patient beyond any human measure of patience, faithful beyond any human measure of faith.